Hi there, Wes Moss. Today, how do you never run out of money in retirement? Well, we've got to follow this one major rule that we'll talk about today. Welcome to Facebook, or really just Money Matters Live. Thanks for joining us. We've done so much research around this. Really, it's the scariest thing about anything to do with financial planning and investing. The biggest fear is running out of money. No matter how much you have, whether it's $500,000 or $250,000 or $1 million or $2 million or $5 million, if you're pulling a too big of a percentage out, it has been studied and studied and studies that you can run out of money. So what's that optimal number so that you're not taking nothing? What's the point of saving if you're only taking out 1%, or avoiding taking too much so that you're worried about totally running out of money? So today, how to never run out of money in retirement, we're going to follow this one major rule. Okay, let me get started here. So what prompted this? Wall Street Journal came out with an article recently that said that the conventional wisdom of, or the rule known as the 4% rule, 4% of your money, and I'll explain that in just a second, very important rule, was too high, and that you could only do 3%. And here's 3% of your money. And Susie Orman recently said you got to work till you're 70. So all of a sudden, it seems like you got to work forever. You can barely take out any of your money. What's the real answer here? Well, it stems from a very important historical study by a guy named William Beggins, MIT aeronautic engineer, super smart guy, turned financial planner. And this is back in the 1990s, the very early 1990s. He came out with a study that went through a bunch of different iterations of withdrawal rates. Hey, if I take this amount of money, if I take 3% or 4% or 5%, what's the likelihood at different starting dates, which is so important here, whether I retire in 2001 or 2 or 5, and in his case, if I retired in 1929 or 1955 or 1965, what was my likelihood of running out of money at all these different iterations, 3%, 4%, 5%, and then all these different portfolio iterations. And what he effectively found out was that, and here's what the rule states, is that you could take 4% of your money, not 5, 3 was too low, 4 was the optimal, and they later updated that to 4.1 and 4.2. But here's how that you arrive at that number, and this is super important. And by the way, you want to see the end of this video, because I'm going to talk about 2 brand new developments in this data that we wanted to share. One is called the Buffett Zone that you need to know about. 2 is called the Danger Zone, and we'll get to that at the end of this video. But in the meantime, here's what the 4% rule says. It says that you take your portfolio value in the first year, and we're going to use $1 million on this. I know it's a big number, but it's a round number, and it's helpful for illustration. Take $1 million, and I take 4% of that initial year number, so $1 million times my initial year of 4% equals $40,000. All right, that's my initial amount I'm going to be withdrawing. Now I'm going to take the dollar amount of $40,000, the dollar amount, my initial 4%, and I'm going to be able to ratchet that up for inflation every single year. And over time, I have a high likelihood of not running out of money. So at 5% inflation in year 2, now I'm taking $42,000 a year from the portfolio. So this is effectively how this study works. I start out with a percentage, I take that dollar amount, and I ratchet up for whatever inflation is every single year. And we see how long it lasts. That's what this is all about. The second piece of this, and I'll give you the results in a second, is that you have to have a portfolio, and Beggins used the S&P 500 and the total return of the 10-year bonds, so stocks and bonds, but very important, rebalanced every single year back to the original 50% in stocks, 50% in bonds. And that's an important piece of the equation as well. And again, I've updated this study, and that's what we're going to get to in a minute, because this was all done as of date of 1992, published in 1994. We brought this into 2018 so that it help you understand this very important concept. What was Beggins' result? Well, Beggins basically said that if you're doing it in this way, 4%, that 80% of the time that your money lasted at least 50 years, in some cases virtually it lasted into infinity, depending on the year you retired. in about 20% of the cases, you unfortunately ran out of money because it was a bad time to start pulling money from your portfolio when it comes to the market. The next piece of this equation is that we wanted to update this data. Or really, the last piece of this is that in the worst case scenario for Beggins, money lasted 35 years. So in most cases, 50 plus, with most retirements aren't 50 years. And in the worst case scenario, 35 years, which again it's still a long time in retirement. We updated that study. So my team at CIA, Capital Investment Advisors, we said, look, let's bring all the data for all the way up to 2017 data, which is what we have, and then make some assumptions, just like Beggins did, out, because if we're going out 50 years, if I retire in 2000 and I'm doing a calculation, I've got to see if the money's still around in 2050. So you have to make some assumptions into the future, and Beggins did the same thing. So we wanted to recreate the study, and we did. So we added all the years prior to 1992 all the way up to 2017. So we added a bunch of years, which gave us 82 different data points to study, or 82 retirement life cycles to study. The next important part of this is that instead of using a full 10%, here's what Beggins used in his assumptions when he ran out of actual data into the future. He used basically 10% for stocks, assumed rate of future return, 5% for bonds, and 3% inflation. I thought that was a little aggressive, and I wanted to bring down those assumptions so that the planning that we're doing here is even more conservative than what Beggins did. And so we effectively used for stocks, we used 5%, and for bonds, we used 2 or 1%, and I'll get to that in a second, and for inflation, we used 3%. So our assumptions for this future planning came down to try to make this more conservative. Now, here's what we got. So again, 82 years of data. Here's what we ended up with. 70% of the time. So close to what Beggins did. Money lasted 50 years plus. Great. 30% of the time, money ran out before 30 years. Worst case scenario, still 29 years. So almost still 30 years worth of your money not running down to zero, taking 4% of the first year value and then ratcheting up for inflation every year thereafter. So we're effectively, one, we're confirming Beggins' study is with real-time data, it's still relevant. Two, it's much more up-to-date, and the results are relatively the same. So the next point here is that I wanted to put a couple of tough retirement years to the test. So we said, well, what about the year 2000? Right after 2000, we had a negative 9% year, then we had a negative 12% year, then we had a negative 22% year, all in a row. Imagine retiring right before that. Not only are you pulling out money, but your portfolio is dropping and dropping and dropping. Well, if, again, we're using our more conservative assumptions in years after 2017 data, we used 5% for stocks, 1% for bonds, and 3% for inflation. In the year 2000, money, in our scenario here, is a tough time to retire. Money still lasted 41 years. 41 years. Important to know. How about 2008, right? 2008, another really, really tough year. 2008, money still lasted 39 years by using those really low conservative market assumptions. Now, we also looked at this and said, hey, wait, what about 5%? Well, 5%, if we don't use inflation, so if we use inflation at 0, pretty interesting. If we, again, 5% of $1 million is 50,000, then we keep that constant. Well, that money lasted in our scenario 65 years. Now for these two really important new developments when it comes to withdrawal planning. One I call the Buffett Zone, one I call the Danger Zone. The Buffett Zone is good news. And I named this after Warren Buffett because his total return for his Berkshire Hathaway is over, it's about 2.4 million%. I know that's not a misprint, 2.4 million% compounded since he started back in the mid-1960s. remarkable, hence the name, the Buffett Zone. This is what the Buffett Zone looks like. If we're looking at a chart of your money, what happens here is that if we're starting at this level, because let's say you get a couple good years of the market in the very beginning, what happens to your money is it almost gets this pattern of infinity. And why does it do that? Well, it does that because if you've got a couple really good years in the beginning of your planning and markets are up 8%, 15%, 30%, then all of a sudden you've got a bigger base to work from. So now your million might be $1.4 million, but you're still only taking around $40,000, maybe a little bit higher with inflation. So now you really only need to take around 2% of your base now to still get you that original $40,000, $45,000. So it becomes very easy for the portfolio, low stress. All of a sudden you get this compounding effect. We call it the Buffett Zone, and that's what ends up happening to your money. This actually happened if you retired in 1955. You ended up with a tremendous amount of money by 2017 to the tune of something close to $100 million. And it's just because the timing worked out almost perfectly. Now, on the other side of the equation, the danger zone here, highway to the danger zone, is when things go the other direction and you have a really tough start for your portfolio, number one. And number two, you get a lot of inflation. So now you're 40, in a couple of years you're having to take 50, and then we're building on 50 and we've got to take 60, now we're taking 80. All of a sudden that puts a ton of stress on a portfolio that, let's say in bad timing, did not do well to begin with. Now all of a sudden, instead of having to withdraw 2% a year to get what you need, you're withdrawing 6% a year. Because again, it takes 6% of the corpus to get you to the number, that inflation adjusted number you need. And this is what happens. It's almost the opposite. You end up with this tailing off effect where you end up with very, very little money, or you run out of money very, very quickly. And this is what happens. This is the danger zone. Now, we talked about a couple of different things. We've talked about the importance of this trying to understand and stay in this 4% initial value and then keep that number for inflation. If we get to the point where we're now taking 6 or more of the portfolio, you're in the danger zone, and you're very, very likely to be running out of money long before retirement, or long before 50 years, and potentially much sooner than you want in retirement. So we also know that in the Buffett zone, and the other side of the equation is you have a couple good years, it puts a whole lot less stress on your portfolio. But the reality here is that in retirement, it's not linear, and we don't just stick on the exact same path. It's a dynamic and decision-based that you say in any given year, you reassess. And you say, hey, 40,000 was good. We still only need around 42,000, and we've had a couple great years. Well, you can maybe take some of that extra return and maybe renovate the kitchen, or you do a bigger trip than you would have done, or an extra vacation. And that's just the nature of the withdrawal rate planning. If you have a couple tough years in the market, then you might have to scale back a little bit and go less than that 4% withdrawal rate, or that 4% number. So the point here is that, and we've done so much research around this, staying around that 4% initial dollar value relative to the portfolio, that's the key. Anytime you start getting higher than that to meet your needs, 6% plus, you're getting in trouble, and you're going to have to just scale back. If the opposite happens and things are going really well, then maybe you can go ahead and spend a little money. And that's the key here, is to understand that this is a fluid, dynamic process that you got to go through every year as you do your retirement planning. And it's so important. And we'd appreciate you sharing this. Share it with your friends. This is important stuff. Share it with your parents. Share it with your friends, your colleagues, because the 4% rule has now been updated by our team. And I think it's really important information for you to understand as you go into your retirement planning. So with that, thank you. Of course, you can find me at wesmoss.com. There's an email button. Those emails come straight to me and the team. Happy to help with your particular scenario in planning as it gets customized and it gets complicated, and we're happy, of course, to answer those questions. Otherwise, I wish you a profitable day. Thanks so much for tuning in.